we have time for discussion. And I think that the concluding remarks that you heard were especially apt as we think about the disproportionate effects of climate change on populations that are already struggling, whether these are ethnic minorities in the developed world, whether this is sub-Saharan Africa or South America, where the effects of climate are going to be incredibly profound much more quickly. And I think that what you've heard is about how all of the science that we've been discussing around the rapidity of change, on the mitigation of change, really depends on human actors and on understanding the challenges to human communication and human action. So I will turn it over to my colleague to start off our panel.
Sure. Thank you, Marina. And I've been fortunate to be able to talk with most of you at points throughout the conference, and you've seen in the last hour or so, hour and a half, this has been quite a journey in terms of the research that's being done and how it's being done. But I also know, in speaking with these amazing individuals, they've also taken quite a journey in terms of where they ended up disciplinarily and in terms of the subject matter that they're focusing on, which is quite sophisticated, as you've seen. So my first question for them is really about the kinds of issues you've faced in working across disciplines. Because some of the stuff you're doing, it's pretty groundbreaking. The New Frontiers program, 6-second plug, was designed specifically to get at this sort of broader reach, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. That's what it was for. That's what it was designed for, even though only about 10 or 15% of projects that are funded under our New Frontiers project really get to that point. But that's what it was supposed to do, and I think these are brilliant examples, even though we've only funded one of you, of the kind of work that we would fund. Oh, and also, you can be a co-applicant and be funded as long as you have a Canadian partner. So, okay, I'm done. What kind of issues, have you faced in getting where you got?
Do you want to go this way? Okay, sure. So I think I would say, so first of all, when I first started the project on triple-negative breast cancer, when I first applied for funding, the very first year, it was rejected, and the reviewer said that it wasn't relevant to the Canadian context. And that was incredibly devastating because, one, we had Black women in Canada, and secondly, as I said, we've got over, probably close to 1 billion Black women globally. But I don't give up, so I kept trying, and I got funded third time. And then I would say for the New Frontiers project, as I said, we were funded 2 years ago, and the challenge has been getting ethics approval. So although the application specifically said the project was triggered by the community reaching out to the social scientists who then reached out to a geneticist and molecular biologist like me, the ethics board was upset that there was a community partner who had the list of names of people that had cancer. And so that it literally took us a year to get ethics. And so we're now starting that project because we had to explain, if you read the proposal, it clearly stated that the community reached out to us because they noticed these high levels of cancer in their community. So that was a big barrier, and I think maybe something New Frontiers needs to communicate to all of our universities, that some of these projects are initiated by the communities and not by the researchers themselves. So.
I think we're going to go in order across. So. Yeah, so I mean, I actually have a background in physics and then kind of went into biology. And I can say that I think it was actually quite a positive experience because I think a lot of at least the biological community and the animal behavior community was very welcoming of people from different disciplinary backgrounds. And I've also recently just started collaborating with some social psychologists. And one thing that is been quite kind of surprising to me is how similar the language of animal behavior and social psychology is. So I think that's something that can often be a challenge in these like interdisciplinary collaborations, and I'm sure even more when you sort of get broader and move across societal sectors. I mainly have experience just within science, but yeah, I think that's something that is important to think about is like the language that we're using, and sometimes we're saying the same things or using different words to say the same things. But I personally have found that those barriers are possible to cross as long as you, clearly explain what you mean and with communication, basically. Yeah.
Okay, just to add a little bit, and I want to highlight, like maybe some of speakers already highlight in the previous session. So one of the issues that I encountered, especially during a pandemic, is language is important, and how we communicate. And scientists, my background is chemistry, but when I moved to social scientists, in fact, I still have time to learn to define, and when I talk to civil society, which is sometimes housewives or maybe farmers, I cannot use positive tipping points to talk with them. So I really need to think to get insightful narratives from them, I have to translate this kind of language into their context. So within the chaotic of pandemic, it was quite, really challenging. And also I want to contribute to one of the participants during my research, because one of them actually is a victim of a pandemic and they passed away, and indeed the narratives are still there.
Yeah, I had the privilege of working cross-disciplinarily, essentially for all my research life, starting from my master thesis and PhD. So I've quite a colorful and wide range of experiences. And let me say first that I find it incredibly enriching to reach out to different other fields and learn from them. So this is my overriding remark. Whatever the costs, the personal gain in terms of intellectual stimulation and creativity are really boundless. Also, you could say in terms of culture, the different fields have different cultures, and it's quite a difference when you enter a physics department or a biology department, and it's kind of nice to be familiar with both. But a little bit more concretely, it's often said that our disciplinary academic environment is putting the dampers on cross-disciplinary research, and by and large, I think that is true. If I go over the very different experiences I had, I would, however, see two different types of cross-disciplinary work, or maybe two ends of a spectrum. The one happened, fortunately for me, very early. When I came from physics, I had all my head full of methods from nonlinear dynamics and stochastic process theory, and I started to interact with a theoretical biologist who had questions, well-defined, precise questions in a language he could explain to me, and I could basically help him solve these questions in a short amount of time, and that was enjoyable for both of us. So well-defined questions and a common language accelerated this productivity of the cross-disciplinary interaction tremendously. And then later, I had other interactions where the questions were not so well defined. The challenge was to pry out the question, to distill the question from this interdisciplinary dialogue. Also, the language was not common yet, and we had to spend a lot of time developing it. And in my experience, those types of more burdensome or slow cross-disciplinary interactions are better suited for a later part of the career when you're not so much under publication pressure anymore.
Okay, so as the last, they have already put everything nicely, so I don't have much to say, but only one thing if I can add to say is so when I started collaboration, at the beginning I thought that I have to entertain my possible future collaborator and, because I wanted to get their attention, then I thought that I can work well. But again, like you guys said, of course we have language barrier, culture barrier, and then it's really difficult to come with. And I just thought that, why do I need to do this? These guys are expert in their field, right? Why don't I just come up and say, hey, this is my problem. Can you solve it? And that was more straightforward. And they said, oh, yeah. Right. So I think you can just keep it simple and then just basically approach to those people who's expert in this field and just show you respect, and then it works. So that's my comment.
I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. If you have some for a more general question to start for the panelists, so we can go across all of our panelists. Pavel?
So thank you and congratulations again for this fascinating expose of different angles in the, I think, one of the most important items we have, how to involve institutions, humans, behavioral, in this transition which we are heading for. So I have two questions. One is systemic, other one is, Julie, to you. On the systemic one, so basically we have heard here 1+3 different perspectives. I will start with Ulf, who presented to me, very well known because I was privileged to work with him for 8 years at IIASA before, mathematically modeled systems in which systems are mathematically responsible, they are very much parameterized. And he mentioned that he concluded that, of course, these are agents which don't think, which don't feel, which don't have any rational or any emotional feelings. So we said there is an opening. Then we had 4 examples, right? We had one from Tomomi, showing that actually we can go quite deep into human brain to understand the language. We heard many times from others that language is important in the communication. Then we heard that we know about the meerkat social behavior more than about humans. Actually, this is what I'm saying. When I joined HSSB, I think we understand more of that. Again, going deeper into the brain. Then we heard about the social institutions and humans in terms of the response in Indonesia. So these are real people, right, responding to the real challenge. And then we heard about the very specific issue of the ethnicity and one of the most important challenges, which is cancer. That's a connection as well. Ulf, if you would have a choice to spend all the money of the world with your colleagues over there, how would you incorporate these insights, which are all needed to your models? What would be the way to go ahead? How would you put them together into a little project, big project, to make a real step ahead in what we really need to do?
Yeah, thank you for this question. As you noticed, I pitched my whole presentation on this idea of model-based integration, because I found, well, thanks to my background probably as in theoretical physics, that once you cast a question in a quantitative way with precise variables and parameters, a certain clarity emerges that often remains elusive when one just writes about it in words. But that doesn't mean that this model-based research is the only way, and I recognize that. Actually, I profit a lot from reading interesting philosophical essays about social phenomena that inspire my thinking. So it's complementary, it's not exclusionary, it's complementary. So if you now ask, what do we need for model-based research on communication, coordination, cooperation to move forward? Well, I think there are so many research fronts that it would be arrogant to pick just one. But I mean, since you ask, I would think cognitive biases are so essential, at least for environmental action. Whether people are willing to invest into the next generation, whether they are altruistic towards their peers, is an issue that is still not sufficiently understood, and it sails under the issue of cognitive biases, right? Because cognitive biases are defined by not being maximizing your payoff, so it's actually a derogatory name for a good thing. But understanding that and understanding how maybe some nudging, some context, some environmental feedback can promote pro-social and pro-environmental action, that I think one could investigate in specific stylized experiments. I mean, not numerical experiments, but human experiments, and try to translate that into models and try to translate that into actionable work.
That question of unlimited resources and where would you put your attention if you were not constrained by unlimited resources is one that really cuts across all of these questions. Would one of the rest of you like to take that on?
I mean, I also kind of would throw it back and say, of course, we don't want to invest all in one thing. We've talked about this multiple times, that we need to understand a variety of different interacting processes in order to make progress. One thing that I think has come out a couple of times across different topics is this idea about collective systems and sort of emergent processes and tipping points. I think multiple people mentioned this. And to me, I think this is something that we really need to understand better, especially in human behavioral systems, because we as a species are facing the biggest coordination challenge that we have ever had. And I guess like one thing that we see coming out of even really simple models of collective behavior is that there are a lot of instances in which there's multi-stable states, and also there's memory within these systems as well. So if you just change the rules in one direction and then move it back, you won't get back where you started. So I think on the one hand, these are kind of scary, these ideas of tipping points, but potentially these could also be a bit hopeful, because maybe in these types of complex systems, when you need a very big group level change, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need always a very big individual level change. And so maybe thinking about, are there sort of levers that we can push on in terms of human behavior that might generate feedback loops that would be helpful in tackling some of these larger problems? I think that would be really interesting to explore.
Yeah, I think that leads to the question of tipping points. Are there specific things that you think, with resources available, could push on those tipping points and actually begin to catalyze change?
Is that for me, or? I'm not a social scientist, so well.
No, that was for Cynthia.
I would jump in and say, I think the pandemic taught us a lot. I think many of us thought, especially in the first 4 to 6 months when everyone was locked down and suffering and, begging for a vaccine, literally. And then this bizarre phenomenon happened where suddenly it took too long. They weren't trusting scientists. They weren't trusting big pharma. And we ended up with a group that just became strong anti-vaxxers. They don't trust the system. And many of them also felt disenfranchised prior to that. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is to figure out how to get those people that are feeling disenfranchised, and this is Ulf's, hopefully his expertise, we have to figure out how to get that group of really vocal and incredibly powerful people across the world now in every single country to trust scientists again. I think they've lost a lot of trust in scientists, and we have to and I think that's the biggest challenge that we have before we can do all of this, but if we still have people that don't trust us, we're going to have that lovely graph that you had where it's not going to move, or it's going to get worse. So.
Okay, I'm going to turn to the audience. I see a hand right there.
Thank you. I have a question to Ulf. You described modeling, different levels of modeling with scales and so on. So I'd like to know do you have some insight into the modeling of collaboration between institutions and individuals, citizens, in the context of policy making, or in the context of taking up innovations, technological innovations? Do you have some insight into how a modeler should characterize the behavior of institutions? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That is a very good question that I've also grappled with throughout my research life. So if you want to make an impact on politics, I think the short answer is you have to invest a lot of time and energy and heart into the interactions with the political institutions, with ministry bureaucracies, with appropriate agencies, and keep pushing for years and years, build relations of trust and gradually expand them. So that is very much along the co-creation and co-development paradigm. And I think that is how it usually works. I have seen this operating at IIASA, the National Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, where I worked for 25 years in Austria, together with Pavel, where models of transboundary air pollution ended up, or actually entered the political debate so early that the responsible people in the ministries were very pleased with relying on the data. It was an honest broker role that the scientists could play, and then kept relying on that modeling and kept also funding the expansion of that modeling for 2 or 3 decades now. So that is, I think, the route, very labor intensive, very resource intensive, and very much focused route that I think works. on the other hand, you have occasionally the fashion-driven, I would almost say, leap to the forefront of an issue, and then maybe one is very fortunate to be asked by some politicians or some people in the bureaucracy to help with that issue. So that's sometimes happening, but I think it's far less frequent.
Okay, other questions? We have our spotter. It's kind of hard to see from here because of the light. We got it. Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Thanks to all of you for really informative, inspiring talks. I have a question for Juliet. The statistics you provided on the incidence of breast cancer in West Africa are staggering. And I'm wondering if there's any information about environmental factors that may be contributing to this extremely high rate.
So again, part of the challenge is this trust issue. So it's multifaceted and complex, and we don't have enough Black researchers or Black clinicians. And as we sadly know, many of the universities and hospitals in Africa are under-resourced. So that's a huge challenge there. And some of it is as well, there are not as many hospitals in the rural areas or clinics, so the women, when they go to finally decide to go, they are at very advanced stages. So that's why the mortality rate is as high as it is. If they were going a little earlier, it probably would be a little lower. But there's also I would say, in Black communities in the Caribbean and in Canada, there's a stigma as well about cancer. Women and Black communities are more than happy to talk about diabetes, heart and stroke, every disease but cancer. And they will actually, when they're talking about it, they will say, oh, so-and-so has just been diagnosed with the C word. They will not use the word. There's a huge stigma.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons, like, I partner with a cancer support group in Toronto, and we're pretty much doing a road show too many times a year. I have to remind them that I have a full-time job. But, you know, we do a road show to basically increase awareness about cancer, to tell them what I call Cancer 101, explain what a cell is, what is a gene, what is a protein, because they really don't understand it, and they think it's a curse.
Right.
And so we're starting, like, yeah.
Certainly that with mortality rates, but even just the incidence, I think you gave very high statistics, and you also mentioned this location in Canada, in Nova Scotia, where there's a toxic dump. So I was wondering if there's evidence for something like that going on.
In West Africa?
Yeah.
Possibly, as I said, that's what but again, there are not that many labs studying this globally. So there's maybe 4 or 5 of us in North America and a few in West Africa, but again, West Africa is highly under-resourced, and so we need more hands on deck to tackle this problem in Africa. Yeah.
Okay, other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So I was, in the absence of a lot of raised hands, I will take the privilege of saying that when I was watching the meerkats and the marmosets and thinking about the humans, I couldn't help but think about the dancers last night and thinking about how even without one person leading, you can actually coordinate behavior. So I actually wanted to ask Gloria Benedict if after her presentation last night, she asked for scientists to weigh in about some of the fundamental processes that might in fact be underlying the movement of her dancers. And I'm wondering if after this panel there were specific recommendations from dance that you might give our panelists, or if there are specific questions that you have for the panelists. But I think you have to push the button because your mic is not red. There you go.
Well, actually, maybe it's not so much about the dancing itself now, but one aspect that I missed a little bit from the discussion was that, so we talked about, I took my notes, cognitive bias and nudging and so on, and how to change people's behavior. But we didn't yet talk about how to change people's perspective, because I think that would be the prerequisite, and behavior change would be much easier if we change perspective. And so then coming back maybe to yesterday's work that we showed, like in breath, with this overarching story, yeah, that can change people's perspective, and that would also help us to then change the behavior. So maybe that would be something to add.
Thank you. So I think in particular with disparities, changing the story of science is science to there are people disproportionately suffering from specific aspects of medical illness, and we need to change our focus and our narrative. It is very relevant. We have 5 minutes left. So in this last 5 minutes, if you could go across the panel starting in this direction first, and just give us maybe some last thoughts about changing from communication to action, and whether some of the things that you've learned about language or about communication might actually give us suggestions about moving from talking to acting.
Well, that's an interesting question, but at the same time, it's a very difficult question to answer. Like, okay, so I can't answer for this, but what I can tell you what I think about. It's really difficult to deal with that. And then, like I said, we actually, every day, evolution is still going on. So probably we are changing, right? And just we're not seeing because it's going so slow. But at the same time, like I said, we are having more different type of inputs, or like we didn't have cell phone like 50 years ago, right? But now everyone's using cell phone. So neuroscientists actually make a joke, because since everyone's doing this, probably our sensory region for our pointer will be larger. So that kind of thing can happen, and that will also change people's behavior. So I think there's a lot of factors that we should not skip. And then at the same time, like animals, they're not using cell phone, right? So our evolution might be going a little bit in a different way. So I think that's the reason why we have to keep, thinking, and also the researcher have to keep, looking, whatever the system that you're interested in, to really find the fundamental mechanism. And then also whatever cell phone case or AI comes in, and that can actually change that kind of direction. But I think we can't stop this, right? And then we don't know whether it's good or not. At least it's good for the life, but I don't know it's good for the brain at least. But we need to know what is exactly happening, and I think we are for that.
Yeah, thank you for a very pertinent question. I would like to answer with 3 brief statements. So first, I think we must all guard ourselves against a certain delusion of grandeur, which comes from thinking that our research is so fundamentally important that everybody needs to listen. I think that is rather widespread in the scientific community, and it's totally unrealistic. So I think we must sort of cut the ties with that perspective. And then secondly, the post-rationalization phenomenon that we see in most humans is very strong. So often people have a gut reaction to some issue, and later they collect the rational basis or justification for this gut reaction. And that means that if you enter the interaction with them past that post-rationalization point, it's basically a lost cause. And I think many of the issues have evolved in such a fashion that positions are so deeply entrenched that you can endlessly battle, but it doesn't move the fronts anymore. And then thirdly, as a little bit of glimmer of hope, in the 90s there was a strong emphasis on chaos control. Maybe some of you remember chaos control, using the complex dynamics of nonlinear systems to nudge them at the right point, in the right direction, in the right magnitude, to enact certain changes down the line that were far bigger than the nudge. So I think once we understand better these complex nonlinear dynamics of social interactions and public debates, maybe that will become possible, and probably means that we have to enter topics which are not yet in the stage of lock-in.
Nice.
For me, because I did empirical research, I just want to share my journey in order to ask all of the stakeholders just to stop and listen, so they try to change their perspective, like from no interest to interest to my research. So basically, thanks to the artist that inspired me yesterday, and I learned that language, again, is still important, and given us some creativity to our research, at least in social science, and then give a creative language, like the persuasive language to our participants and understanding their position. I think at some point they will stop and listen and give an interest before making some changes.
I thought it was interesting that you asked the question in terms of how to move from communication to action. Whereas I mean, at least thinking from a meerkat perspective, we know that these things are intricately linked, right? And often it's you're communicating and you're acting, and that affects your communication. Maybe just a little metaphor, like in the meerkats, we find that they have these calls that they use to initiate movement and potentially changes in direction. And it turns out if they just make the call, not much happens. If they just move, not much happens. But if they call and move, then that turns the group, right? So I guess the point would be maybe thinking about how we can both communicate and act at the same time, and how we can possibly generate some feedbacks between communication and action.
I like that.
And I would say that I think as scientists, we all need to learn multiple languages, not like just French, Spanish, whatever, but we need to learn to communicate with the disenfranchised. We also need to learn to communicate with those that are not as well educated, and to communicate our science in what we call a layman's terms, because there is this perception that we're an elite class of people that don't understand the average person. And that's, definitely over the past decade working with the Black communities in the Caribbean and in Canada, that is pretty much the message loud and clear. They want to trust us, but they are not sure that we genuinely care, and they feel like we speak down to them. And so I think that that's something, if we want to move to action, that's something we should all work on immediately, how to communicate our science in a way that everyone can understand and buy into it, because that will then help us to move collectively faster, I think. Just a simple one to do.
And with that, I think that's the perfect last word for this panel. Thank you very much to all our panelists. Thank you to you for your attention.